Good morning. Welcome to today's Strategic Farming Let's Talk Crops program. We're happy to have you join us for today's session on the forecast for the 2025 planting season and considerations for 2025 crop success. These sessions are brought to you by University of Minnesota Extension and generous support from Minnesota Soybean Research and Promotion Council and Minnesota Corn Research and Promotion Council. Without those sponsorships, we wouldn't be able to bring these programs to you. My name is Angie Peltier. I'm a University of Minnesota Extension crops educator at the Northwest Research and Outreach Center in Crookston. Today, we welcome Dr. Dennis Todey. He is the director of the invaluable USDA Midwest Climate Hub. And we also have with us Dr. Jeff Coulter. He's the University of Minnesota Extension corn agronomist. With that, I will turn it over to Dennis Todey.
Thank you, Angie. I appreciate the introduction. I like the invaluable part. That's kind of funny. Anyway, this is part of what we do as our partnership with our regional partners and extension, universities, and a wide variety of other people to talk about what's going on at a range of timescales. What's going on now, while looking to the future, so that we give agriculture its best opportunity to mitigate risk, avoid some of the larger issues, and to deal with some of the more widely varying issues that we're seeing here now. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time today giving you a couple different things about what the hub does, and then give you a quick outlook for where we are now and a little bit about the growing season. So and I also say this is one of my favorite things to do, is to get out and talk to people. I always enjoy doing it in person, but this is a great opportunity to reach out to people without spending a whole lot of time, and because we can't travel right now anyway. So anyway, what we do with the Midwest Climate Hub, part of 10 hubs nationally and now an international climate hub, we cover our 8-state region, which is most of the Corn Belt, trying to share information, develop information, work with partners to help agriculture deal with what's going on, understand, develop products, and share information regionally. That's that is the short version of what we do, and what all of our staff is trying to do throughout all of this. And we try to work across crops, across the region, to help share about research, develop new research, and share things about what is going on and help people understand what is going on. So that is the short version of what we're trying to do. And I'm going to quickly introduce you to a couple new tools that are relatively new. One of these is just rolled out last year, is on soil temperature climatology. One of the things that we found talking with our partners and understanding it was, we have climatologies of temperature and precipitation, but we don't have good climatologies for soil temperature because we don't have data for long-term data, or enough spatial coverage of data. So we worked with the Midwestern Regional Climate Center to come up with a soil temperature climatology that is basically based around understanding when we reach certain temperature criteria in the spring and the fall. The main one, obviously, 50 is a big one, but we have other criteria that we can reach. So this graphic, for example, shows when, on average, over the last 30 years, foreign soil temperature cools below 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So like southwestern Minnesota, northern Iowa is that lighter blue, is that the last 10 days of October. The next category up would be the middle 10 days of October in the little bit darker blue. And then we also have when the soil freezes, et cetera. Now, the advantage we've had with this one is we've been able to cover a lot more of the area in some of the forested areas where we didn't have data before that. So this is kind of a unique set of data that we've been able to get at. We've had some updates to the site where we can now look at time trends of when these dates are reached. So anyway, check this website out as a chance to try to do that. Where this originally came from was people doing, fall nutrient application, understanding when we reach certain temperatures, so that people understood those different time frames. The other one, also with the Midwestern Regional Climate Center, that's really important across the region, especially our northern areas, understanding our trend in freeze dates, what's happening in the spring and the fall on freeze dates. We know that freeze dates are getting earlier in the spring and later in the fall. So what these two graphics are showing, the two maps are showing, and this is also at the Midwest Regional Climate Center at Purdue, it goes county by county. And the colors there are the trend in the first fall 28 Fahrenheit freeze dates in the upper left-hand side, and the last spring 28-degree Fahrenheit when we reach that in the spring. And then the trend. So like up here and across much of northern Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, that trend is quite strong that first time we're hitting 28 in the fall is getting much later. As you get down to southern Minnesota, northern Iowa, the trend is there, not quite as strong. And we have some, you see some blue there that the trend is kind of mixed. There's not a whole lot of a trend over that time period. And then down in the spring here below, you see that same kind of thing. Obviously, if you're putting those two things together, that's changing your growing season. So also on the website, what you see here is the darker green is the longer growing season, how much we're lengthening that growing season. And this is since 1950. So this gives you an opportunity to look locally, because previous graphics that I had seen had by state or by region, well, the season's getting 10 days longer over the last century over like a 3-state area. I said, that doesn't help people. We need to know this locally so people have an understanding of this. So check this out. This is a great opportunity to start looking. We know there's been some shifts of people trying to plant soybeans earlier. This can give you a comparison of, is that a good idea? Given what's happening with our soil freeze date. Okay. Anyway, I'll take questions about those at the end too. Happy to talk more about those. Okay, touching on current conditions right now, where we are, and then what going on to where we're headed. Angie was talking earlier about precipitation and concerns about precipitation, and there are legitimate concerns related to this here. First off, last 30 days. On the left-hand side, what we've had for precipitation last 30 days, right-hand side, percent of normal last 30 days. So anything that goes to green or purple is wetter or above average. Anything that goes to red is drier. Okay, so much of Minnesota has had some precipitation over the last 30 days, southern and then a path up through it. So we've had some improvement in our moisture conditions, though we've had frozen soil, so probably didn't get into the soil moisture profile. While western parts of the state and into the Dakotas, has been very dry, and we're going to talk about how the effect on the drought monitor here recently. Get down here in Iowa and over to parts of Wisconsin, we've been wetter over that time period, so seeing some improvement in the drought situation there. But for context for that wetness, let's go back 4 months and see what has happened over that 4-month period. Again, precipitation left-hand side, percent of normal on the right-hand side, and this all happens after that wet period we had in November. So we've been relatively dry throughout all the region except for, you see this green area down along the Ohio River Valley. They were more active during the winter. Most of the Corn Belt was really fairly dry, and this impacted what we saw in the way of a snow drought. I didn't find the graphic I was looking for this morning, but we've had, a large snowfall deficit throughout much of Minnesota during the winter time, which has impacted a couple of the things we're going to talk about here. Okay, contrast here. Now we're going to talk where we are on the soil temperatures. This is from some Minnesota soil temperatures through the North Dakota Ag Weather Network that they help do some of the monitoring. You see down in southern Minnesota, we are above freezing. This is at the 6-inch level, I believe. We are somewhat above freezing, whereas you get up into central, western, still below freezing in that area. So we have some work we have to do. Snow, where are we? On snow cover. We still have some snow cover further north. We've had some snows. Most of the rest of the state, there really is not much in the way of snow depth overall, a little bit down in the southeast. Now, this may continue to change because we do see several, well, we'll talk about this more in the outlooks, a more active pattern coming up that will continue to drop some snow. Some of them could be decent snows. They should not be long-lived, but there will be some more snow. I'm quite confident that's going to be coming over the region. From a soil moisture perspective, you see some orangish colors on the left-hand graphic, not as much on the right-hand graphic. These are two national soil moisture products. So hints that soils are on the drier side, maybe not terrible at this point. This goes to the 100 centimeter profile, so about a meter that we have. So we have some dryness that's not terrible just yet. But because of that lack of snow cover and the dry soils, we have developed some pretty good frost depths. Here's a National Weather Service graphic on frost depths across the region. You see parts, around the Twin Cities, southern parts of the state, no frost depths. We still have, 3 feet of frost in some areas. Again, with the drier soils and some precipitation coming, we should be able to start working on this. And we have, again, reminder, that we are above freezing, especially in the southern part of the state. So we've started working our way down. So it's going to be a little bit of slow going, but we will be able to work on this overall. Then from a drought perspective, this is last week's drought monitor. The new one will not come out until tomorrow. Will be released. There will again be a few little changes around. But here's where we are nationally. Again, yellow is D0, white is no drought, yellow is D0, considered abnormally dry, technically not a drought status. And then lots of coverage, and you can see a zoom up here where we are in Minnesota. Lots of D1, a little bit of D2 in a couple places, but you see off to our west, you noted that the drier area, the Dakotas and Nebraska, a lot more drought coverage to our west, and some even all across the northern Corn Belt. The central and southern part of the Corn Belt, not quite as much, as we've had some precipitation events that have covered that area. Now, just for context, I threw this in because this has come up recently talking about drought status and more of this. Here is the percent coverage of Minnesota on the U.S. Drought Monitor map going back to the beginning of the Drought Monitor in 2000. You see, some variability to this, but from this period from 2015 to 2020 really did not have much in the way of drought coverage. But since then, we've had more regular coverage, and that's not something we're used to seeing as much in Minnesota. We tend to think of a wetter area, less drought issues, but we've had more recurring drought issues. So it doesn't, your perception that it seems like it's happening more, we are in a period that is happening more, and something more that we need to keep talking about. Not to stress people, but at least to keep people aware of what's going on right now. So I'm going to bop past La Nina here and get on right to the outlooks to keep this moving along. Okay, I'm going to do where we are right now and then process through the spring and then give you one for the summer here to kind of give you an overall outlook. Okay, next 7 days, what we are expecting to see in the way of precipitation. You see Minnesota, southeastern Minnesota has some better chances for precipitation over the next 7 days. I mentioned, and I looked through the computer models even beyond 7 days, and it looks like we're going to stay relatively active. Individual events may not be huge, but they may be enough to start putting some moisture on the soil. And where we have the soil thaw, this will help us to put more moisture back in the soil. The area where we have some frost depths, some precipitation would help us to start to thaw that also. You see here down in Iowa, we may be a little bit more of the beneficiary of this over the next 7 days. The 8 to 14 day outlook will point out precipitation on the right-hand side. The green, it's the first cut of green, so it's not a big indicator, but we do lean to a more active pattern continuing into that first week of April. So probably not a bad thing. Again, this is going to be a mixture of snow and rain, which is kind of interesting because you look on the left-hand side and we have a better chance of being warmer than average. So overall, we are likely to be warmer than average, but we are going to see a mixed bag of precipitation throughout this time period. The 30-day outlook then for April, the white indicates equal chances for below or above average. I sat in on the webinar where they talked about this, and they still expect some cold periods, some mixture of warm and cold periods going throughout the month of April. So we're not expecting a widespread, consistent warmth. We expect some cold that will probably keep us from not getting probably not getting well ahead of average in the way of planting. I don't foresee delays, but we probably won't get too much ahead of average. And then the southeastern part of the state, still a carryover of La Nina, a little bit better chance for some precipitation. So that's a little bit of good news there. Now, I'm going to counter the good news. I'm always a good news, bad news kind of guy, looking ahead towards midsummer. All right. One thing that has been consistently talked about is in the outlooks, a slight tilt towards the warm side overall. That may not be a bad thing. I mean, because part of the trend we have seen in the way of temperatures is our summers have been warming, but overnight lows have been warm. So this might be more overnight lows than daytime highs, which wouldn't be a bad thing. The graphic on the right is what concerns me a little bit more, is some increased chance for dryness. And that is showing up in some of the models, and also a trend, some midsummer dryness that I've talked about previously. I didn't include the graphic about that, but we've seen this start showing up more recently, where we've seen some midsummer dryness. So don't bet the farm on this. Don't get too concerned, but keep this in the back of your head when you're planning and doing some of your thinking about, hey, if we do get some midsummer dryness, how am I going to try to deal with this? So, okay, just to keep that out there for you. All right, quick recap. Some recent moisture, still some longer term dryness, snow drought, some deep frost depth, and then some drought persisting that we've had from a carryover from last fall throughout the northern Corn Belt. I didn't dive into it too much. La Nina has been influencing us recently, but it is weakening and going to go away, so it should not be an influence as we go into the summertime. These drought issues are likely to persist. We'll still get some spring precipitation that will eat away at some of it, but we're probably going to either persist or see some of them come back as we go on into the summertime. Spring planting, some frost depth issues, but the drier soils likely are going to be an advantage to not slow us down too much. I don't expect. And then again, that concern about drought persisting, resurging in the summertime. So, all right, last couple things. Just an advertisement also, something we do the third Thursday of the month. We do a webinar series where we do a little bit longer version of what we did here to talk about what's going on and talk about ag and water and other related issues. It's free. You can sign up here or contact me and we'll get you signed up. Here's the Climate Hub website, where we also do an ag outlook. We're going to be releasing a new ag outlook where we take this is a print version where we take the NOAA outlooks and then put an ag front end. What's going on? What are the impacts? And what do the outlooks say? What does that mean for agriculture? We talk about the broad range of agriculture across the whole region. So again, let us, get us. Well, anyway, yes, we're going to be releasing a new one of that next week. We'll just leave it at that. And then here's contact information for us. Again, thank you for having me here. We have been going through a little bit of a rough time in the federal government. So we appreciate your support. If there's anything that we're doing for you that you particularly like, is particularly useful, let us know, because we like sharing those stories up the line, because that's what we're here to do, is to share information and to serve agriculture to deal with the wide range of issues that we're dealing with. Thank you, and I will turn it back over to Angie.
Thank you, Dennis. That was great. And if for folks in the audience here today, if you do not subscribe to those ag focused climate outlooks, you really ought to consider it. They're tremendously useful. I find them that way anyway, because it's not just, okay, here's what we're looking at going forward. Here's how this will actually impact agriculture. And so that little ag bent to it is much more useful than just the generalized forecasts going forward. In my mind, I've found it useful. So consider subscribing to that, folks. We'll get to questions in a couple minutes, but first we'd like to hear from Dr. Jeff Coulter, that's going to be talking about corn and crop considerations for the upcoming growing season.
Okay, well, good morning, everyone. It's great to be here today. I just kind of want to give a little bit of insight into the upcoming spring and what we can be thinking about doing for planting. So I'm going to kind of go through some of the top considerations for corn production this spring. And then I am also going to follow that by answering some of the questions that were put out prior to the meeting here today. So some of the top 5 things I'd want to consider for this spring. First one is avoid tillage and planting when soils are too moist. A good guideline is that the soil should crumble at a depth of 1 inch below the depth of tillage. When that happens, it's generally dry enough for tillage to occur. And by avoiding tillage and planting when the soils are too moist, that helps us to avoid clods. And that's important because clods create air pockets in the soil, thereby reducing the seed to soil contact. And if we want to get uniform emergence, it's really important that we have good seed to soil contact so that that moisture can be imbibed quickly into the seed and that there's no delay in that and that it's consistent among all the seeds that are planted. And obviously, by avoiding tillage when the soils are too moist or planting when the soils are too moist, that avoids compaction, which can reduce root development and thus affecting the uptake of water and nutrients by roots. So that's a key thing to think about. Another thing to think about is trying to achieve uniform emergence. This is really important if we're trying to achieve top corn yields. As an example, if we have a plant that is 1 leaf stage behind the neighboring plants early in the season, that plant that is behind is only going to yield about 80% of what it normally would if it wasn't behind in its development. A third thing we can think about is the soil temperature at planting. For both corn and soybean, a minimum soil temperature would be in the mid-40s, trending higher or stable in the coming days. What we want to avoid is planting when these soil temperatures are to be followed by a cold snap, because that can cause emergence problems. Another thing to think about is the planting date. So I'll just kind of give you some results on average from what we've seen over the years in planting date trials. On average in Minnesota, highest corn yields occur when planting occurs from around April 24th to May 5. Planting before April 18 for corn typically results in yields that are a couple percent lower. And we want to try to complete our corn planting by May 10 in order to avoid significant yield losses due to that delayed planting. And also, the main benefit of starting the corn planting early is making sure that the last fields are not planted late. And sometimes, if we're lucky, the spring arrives early. And in those years, one may want to consider planting a little earlier than normal. A big question that we're getting at this time is whether to plant soybeans or corn first. We've been reading a lot about this in the media based on work that's been coming out of the University of Wisconsin. And I think there's a few things that we can think about here. I'll just kind of go over some general averages for soybean before I talk more about which crop to consider planting first. In general for soybean, highest soybean yields occur when planting occurs in early May or late April. Try to complete the soybean planting by May 20 or May 15. And the other thing is that makes people wonder which crop to plant first is that soybean tolerates very early planting better than corn. So if the soil conditions are good and it's after the insurance date, but before April 18, then it's fine to plant soybean on well-drained fields. But then once we get to about April 18, we want to switch the focus and focus on corn to get that in. So the general take-home point is that nothing has really changed since, over the past few years, other than the realization that soybean tolerates very early planting better than corn does. And because of that, if we have this very early window, some people, if they have the time, are considering planting the soybeans first and then switching to corn once we get to about April 18. Fifth consideration for this spring is planting depth and soil moisture conservation. So generally, a 2-inch planting depth is optimal for corn in almost all conditions, except when it's dry. When we have a very dry spring, dry soils, then planting to 2.5 inches is a good idea. Shallower planting increases the chance of poor nodal root establishment. So the other thing to think about is, you can set the planter at 2 inches, but is it actually planting at 2 inches based on the tillage that's been done and everything else with the planter and such? So it's important to get out there and dig some seeds after you start planting and ensure that they're at the desired planting depth. Another thing to think about is that if it's dry in the spring, as we had a few years ago, one may want to try to conserve moisture so that we have good moisture there for emergence and early growth. And if we're thinking about conserving moisture, then we'd want to be thinking about avoiding unnecessary tillage passes, avoid tilling deeper than needed, and preparing the seed beds close to planting. So that's kind of an overview of the planting things for the spring to think about for corn. Now I'm going to kind of address some of the questions that were proposed prior to the program here. So one of the first questions is what are the best practices for planting corn into winter rye? And there's a nice article about this from the University of Nebraska, and we're going to put that in the chat for you. And I'll just kind of summarize it here briefly. But basically what happens is when rye decomposes, there's a green leachate that's released. And if the corn seeds imbibe this green leachate during the germination process, that can inhibit their emergence, that can hinder them. And that effect is generally worse when planting corn at 5 to 10 days after spraying the rye. So based on this, the people in Nebraska have concluded that it's best to wait to plant corn until 2 weeks after spraying the rye, and especially if there has been a rain after the rye has started to die. An alternative approach that's maybe a little more risky is to plant corn into green rye and then spray the rye a couple days later. And that way the corn is not germinating in the rye leachate. The leachate will be released after the corn has, in this situation, the leachate from the rye would be released after the corn first imbibed the water that's needed for germination. In addition, when planting directly into rye, the risk of germination problems in corn decreases with deeper planting depths. And in Nebraska, the farmers that have been doing this successfully have been saying that they're planting 2.5 to 3.5 inches deep just to avoid germination problems, keeping that corn seed below the zone of that green leachate that comes from the rye when it decomposes. Another consideration when planting corn into rye, especially when it's green, is that that rye residue could wrap up around the row cleaners, creating problems at planting. And also one wants to make sure that the seed V is being closed when planting into rye. So that's kind of an overview on that. And we have a good article that we are going to have put in the chat for that. I will kind of go to the next question here, and that is about what are the best production steps to improve profitability in 2025? So I think obviously the first thing that we want to do is we want to produce a good yielding crop that we can market. So if we don't have that, we don't really have anything to go off of. So planting timely into good soil conditions and achieving a good stand should be key. The other things to think about is that corn needs to get off to a good start, and you don't want to have to replant. And also, very early planting for corn rarely increases yield. It just reduces the chance that your last field is planted late. In addition, if you've applied N and that N gets lost due to too much rain, don't be afraid to apply more N, even when margins are tight. We saw this last year when we had excessive rainfall in lots of Minnesota and in fields where a lot of that pre-plant or early spring N was applied and was lost. The farmers that went in and applied a little more N to kind of compensate for some of that they did see significant yield responses due to that in many cases. So that's something to think about. In addition, it's important to ensure excellent weed control because weeds can rob you of nitrogen and water, which are critical for corn yield. So kind of building off of this, another question that we got before the meeting today is which expenses can farmers cut without hurting profitability? So I think the key one, number one, would be to consider adopting the University of Minnesota Extension fertilizer guidelines. These will reduce cost with minimal or no yield reduction compared to applying fertilizer at higher rates, and therefore resulting in greater profitability. A second option is to consider your foliar fungicide and insecticide applications and only apply those if needed based on scouting and integrated pest management thresholds, typically those from the universities that have been researched. In addition, a way that one could reduce costs is to avoid unnecessary tillage passes in the spring and fall. A good example of where one could cut some costs on tillage may be on soybean stubble. So for example, in many cases, it's unnecessary from a yield standpoint to do fall tillage on soybean stubble for corn that's going to be planted the next year. In many cases, just one pass with a field cultivator in the spring on soybean stubble typically works. So that can save some dollars as well. And then another thing to think about is planting rates. For example, for corn, one could probably safely drop their planting rate to 34,000 seeds per acre and save a few dollars per acre without sacrificing yield. We've done trials over the last 3 years at 2 locations in southern Minnesota, and we compared 34,000 versus 38,000 seeds per acre in continuous corn. And in every single instance, there was no yield advantage to 38,000 seeds per acre. So the 34,000 yielded the same. In addition, there's been some variable rate planting trials that have been done in western Minnesota by the Precision Ag Group, and they've found that the optimal planting rate in many cases, or in the cases where they did this research, was below 35,000 seeds per acre. So I think there's some opportunity there to save a few dollars if one wanted to back down on their planting rate slightly. Another question that I got was, what are some practices for improving crop production on the headlands? Well, when we think about the headlands, the big ones are, we're driving over some corn, so we're losing the stand a little bit. Typically, there's a lot of soil compaction on the headland from the trucks, the turning around, that kind of thing. So I think one of the big things to think about is alleviating soil compactions on the headlands. And there's a lot of ways to do this. We can think creatively about what can we do to reduce soil compaction. A typical approach or one option would be to use a ripper to break up that compacted layer. So we're doing some tillage below the depth of compaction to alleviate that. On the other hand, some people use deep-rooted cover crops on the headlands to break up that compacted layer. Another option would be to avoid driving on and tilling soils when they're wet. And a third one would be to drive on the same wheel tracks throughout the season for all in-season applications if possible. So those are some options. Obviously other things may be thinking about the tires or the tracks that you have on your equipment and trying to choose options that could reduce soil compaction. Another thing to think about for the headlands is ensure that the nutrient applications don't skip the headlands and that they start and stop right at the edge there, and that the headlands are getting the full amount of nutrients that they require. And then a last one is controlling weeds. So typically there are higher densities of weeds and greater diversity of weed species in the headlands. I used to be a crop scout, and before I would go into the field, I'd go around the headlands and see what weeds there were in there, because basically all the weed species that are in the field are going to be in the headlands, and they're also going to be at a high density. So paying attention to the weeds in the headlands is important. And sometimes there are weed species in the headlands that don't exist in the rest of the field. And because of these things, the headlands may require an application of a different post-emergence herbicide mix than the rest of the field, if one had that capability. And they may also require a second post-emergence application. In addition, there are some farmers who even use a row cultivator and go around the headlands just to get them cleaned up and take care of those hard to control herbicide-resistant weeds. So those are some options, but I think soil compaction and weeds are the keys for trying to improve crop production on the headlands. Then I had a question about, has there been any research on systems to break down corn residue faster in no-till? Well, a few years ago, we had a graduate student working with myself and Dan Kaiser who looked at spraying liquid nitrogen and liquid sulfur on corn stubble in continuous corn. And this used a traditional disc grip tillage system. And he wanted to see how that affected crop residue decomposition and the following corn crops yield. And this research was done at Lamberton and Waseca over 3 years. And he found that spraying nitrogen and sulfur on the corn stubble did not affect the rate of decomposition or the following corn crops yield. And that's similar to results from research done in Illinois, where they looked at spraying liquid nitrogen and sulfur on corn residue. I think the key factors affecting residue decomposition in no-till are going to be moisture and temperature. Now, if we could place that residue in contact with the soil, it would decompose a lot faster, but in no-till, typically we leave that standing. So, we're really limited by what is the moisture and what's the temperature. And there have also been some products that have been on the market that have, been suggested to be used to help speed down residue decomposition. I am not aware of any studies that have shown that positive effects of these products. So I think that's something that we can all look into a little bit more further, but I think the options are somewhat limited in what there are that we can use to break down residue faster in no-till. And I will also address some soybean questions because we got some soybean questions today. And Seth Naeve is unable to be here, so I will answer those. So one of the questions is which row spacing produces the highest yield for soybean? Well, the answer is typically 22 inches or narrower. So any form of narrow rows generally outproduces 30-inch rows. A good guideline for what you should be thinking about with regards to row closure is that you want to achieve canopy closure by no later than R5 or the beginning seed stage. So sometimes 30-inch rows can achieve canopy closure by then if they're planted early and we have good growing conditions early in the season. But in many cases, that's not quite the case. And I think we are sacrificing some yield by using the 30-inch rows for soybeans. So that's something to think about. And then another question that we got was, how can we increase soybean yield? So I think there's some key things that we can think about. The first one is ensure that we have adequate soil fertility, especially for P and K. Soybean generally removes more potassium per acre in the grain than corn does. Another key thing is variety selection for soybean. So we want to select for high and stable yields, and we want to select varieties that have appropriate ratings against diseases, soybean cyst nematode, and IDC. So those are really important because they can rob us of yield. And another thing to think about is that the yields of varieties of similar maturities can range largely. In variety trials done by the University of Illinois, they found that the range in yields among soybean varieties of similar maturity can range by as much as 20 bushels per acre at a location. So variety selection is really important in trying to match the yield potential with the disease and IDC package. And then obviously another one is timely control of weeds and pests based on IPM thresholds. That's important for ensuring high soybean yields. And then narrow rows, if possible. Looking for something 22 inches or narrower. And generally, I think what we've seen is that row spacings of 22 inches or narrower, it doesn't really matter what it is, if it's drilled, if it's 15, if it's 22, as long as the white mold is being controlled, the yields of those row spacings generally outperform those of 30-inch rows. And then the last thing is timely planting for soybeans. So I think a good target is to get that soybean planted by mid-May, although there may be a slight advantage to planting that soybean in early May or late April. So timely planting is also important for the soybean yields. And then the last question we have is, how does planting soybean green into a rye cover crop affect iron chlorosis deficiency? So to address this, we kind of need to take a step back. And we know based on previous work that nitrate that's carried over from the previous crops, nitrate in the soil, can increase the presence of chlorosis in soybeans, especially in less tolerant soybean varieties. So if we've got cover crops out there and the cover crop is taking up nitrate in and reducing the amount of soil nitrate, that should therefore help to reduce the prevalence of IDC in the soybean. So I think it's safe to assume that if we plant soybean into a cover crop that's been terminated or into a green cover crop, that cover crop, by reducing the amount of soil nitrate, should reduce the presence of IDC. And the bigger that cover crop was at termination, the more nitrate it's going to remove from the soil, and therefore the greater potential of it to reduce the presence of IDC. So that's kind of an overview of some corn planting things and some of the questions that we received prior to the program. So I will turn it over to Angie now.
Thanks, Jeff. So up here in the northwestern part of the state, we don't have as much pattern tiling as we have in the rest of the state. And so what we see on our headlands is some of that water from the ditches getting leached back into the field, and with that leaching, it's pulling those salts back into the soil there, which then through the process of wind and evaporation make it so that there's a lot of salt at that soil surface. And as you can imagine, that really impacts even weed growth. And so one thing folks might also consider is I know that federal funding is kind of no longer as guaranteed going forward, but I do know that some of the equip sort of programs will pay help to cost share funding for establishing a deep-rooted cover crop there so that that salty area doesn't continue to encroach further into the field. Because what we're seeing is you can see the salt crusted on the soil surface, and very little grows there. And so you hate to see people throw good money after bad and plant that and plan to cultivate that area and plant it as if they're going to expect a productive crop there, because then that's just wasted money. So some things to consider. We do have, so I had a question for you, Jeff. So you had mentioned before getting out of the planter and checking your planting depth, like actually going out and digging some seeds. Now, would a person a person should probably do that in each field, but what about if there's major soil type differences? How can major soil type differences impact planting depth?
We have to think about this reasonably, so I think first thing, just take a step back. You got the center part of the behind the planter, then you got the wings, and sometimes the planting depth where the wings are may be a little bit shallower. Another key thing to think about is, if you have a drastic changes in soil type, you're going from fine textured clay soil to a more sandy soil, then you as soon as you switch, you'd want to think about checking it again. Also, if you've got major changes in residue or tillage patterns between fields, then it would be a good thing to go out and check it a little bit before you get started. So it's planting depth is really important for uniform emergence, so we want to do what we can to make sure that all the seeds are planted at a uniform depth where there's moisture, typically at a 2-inch depth.
So one comment we have here from our old friend Bruce Potter. He mentions that in regards to having a cover crop, it's really important to get terminated, especially before corn, as Jeff was talking about early, but also scouting for army worms, because depending upon where they want to land, where the weather systems take them, you might win the opposite of the lottery and have them show up in your field. And they like that cover crop to lay their eggs in. And so scouting for army worms and then treating when needed is going to be really important. There have been recently stand losses even in soybeans due to army worms. And so that's definitely something to keep in mind as well. Now, Dennis, we one of the questions was with persistent Minnesota drought, how how quickly can we replenish the soil moisture, and how much, and maybe this is a Jeff question too, how much precipitation as rain is needed for a normal corn or soybean crop?
And that's a great question, and I'll tee it up, and then Jeff can take off from there. The thing to remember is when I show the drought monitor incorporates a lot of different pieces of information, shorter term, longer term precipitation. So when you see a level of drought on the drought monitor, you assume soils are probably somewhat drier. But at this point, I don't think soils are incredibly dry. I'm curious what people think from attendees or whatever, if they really are very dry. You're probably short of moisture, maybe, but this is compared to average for this time of year. So you have a few inches of moisture in your soil already. And as I said, we're going to get more active. We'll get some more moisture back in the soil. So I'm not overly concerned about it at this point because more of our issues recently have been towards wetter springs and excessively wet soils. I don't think that's going to be as much of an issue this year, so that there will be a decent amount of moisture available. I'm a little bit more concerned later in the season that there's going to be enough available. Now, how the crop deals with that and how much you need, I know that crops can adjust to some more limited moisture levels, and I'll tee it up and let Jeff take it off from there.
Yeah, thanks, Dennis. Well, I think the thing to remember is that it depends on the timeliness of the rain and how much occurs at each of those rain instances. So if we've got well-distributed rainfall at just the right amounts at the right times, we could probably, there's been examples, Rochester a few years ago when it was a drought year, they had just the right amount of rain at the right times and they had spectacular yields. So 15 inches of rainfall from May through September, we can get tremendous corn yields. But on the other hand, if it's not at the right times, it may take 20 inches of rain to get the same yield. So it's kind of all about the timeliness of that rain and the amount that occurs at each time. But anywhere between 15 to 20, 22 inches or so. I'd say in general, probably closer to 20 inches is where we would want to be to get respectable yields. And then obviously, it's going to depend on other things like soil and water holding capacity and that type of stuff.
Certainly genetics have changed so that they can manage with you still have to have some rainfall, but certainly genetics have changed to be able to deal with less rainfall than we have 20 or 30 years ago.
So, a question for Dennis here. Are windy days more common now than 20 years ago?
That's an outstanding question that we don't have a good answer for. We've actually had some of our people looking at trying to understand this. How we measure wind has changed a little bit back in the mid 90s from human observations to automated observations. So when you're comparing that break, it's hard to understand that a little bit. And we have actually more automated stations now than we had previously. So we're getting more information now. The indications are that there's not a big change. It's, people may be perceiving it, but there's not a big change overall in the amount of wind that we're seeing. But again, we haven't been able to give a good answer to that question.
Okay, thank you. One for Jeff here. Do you have any recommendations to limit wildlife damage to crops? Pamela wants to know.
Uh, I think that would be a good question for, maybe somebody at the DNR or NRCS. That's a tricky one. I do see, while we're looking at the questions, I do see one question that asks, why did I not mention about strip till for increasing profitability? Well, mainly because I was thinking about things for this spring that we could do and not necessarily thinking about the whole system. But obviously, strip till is a great way to, I think, use things more efficiently. First off, by strip tilling, you can get almost twice the efficiency of your P and K, so you can get by with less since you're banding it in the row there. And also you're tilling less soil. And it could also greatly reduce your equipment costs. I mean, I know the strip till equipment is expensive, but so is a big disc ripper and having the ability to pull that and the time required for all of that. So I think strip till is definitely a good thing to think about if we want to think about using our nutrients more efficiently and protecting our soil and achieving the same or higher corn yields. So that's something to consider as well.
So thank you, Jeff. It seems to me, but maybe it's just because I pay attention to the weather forecast and climatology, but are we cycling faster with our El Nino La Nina cycling? And have have climatologists worldwide been able to better understand those trends from a predictive standpoint?
I don't think we're cycling faster on the El Nino La Nina than we have been. What we are cycling faster about is there was a paper came out a couple years ago from the Illinois State climatologist about flip-flopping conditions back, like wet, dry conditions flip-flopping back and forth more quickly than we've had previously, even within seasons. It's hard, it's a little hard to quantify because you're talking about spatial differences and timing differences. But people are perceiving, we are flip-flopping back and forth between, and we are, the data indicate that we are doing that, which is what leads to problems from a predictive side that, like going in this year saying, well, we're a little bit dry, like, so we're probably not too bad, shouldn't be too wet. We can get big rainfalls and suddenly that prediction goes out the window and it becomes a major issue. And last year was even an example of that. We were dry going in, and I said we're going to carry some of this throughout. Southern Minnesota, Northwest Iowa got hammered in June, and then it stopped raining again. So you had this flip flop back and forth that makes understanding and making decisions incredibly difficult. So that's what concerns me from a decision making standpoint.
You bet. So a question here from our friend Dave Nicolai. Can we influence corn rooting depth, Jeff? He says some corn hybrids have been sold in the past as more drought tolerant. Is there any advantage as well to short statured corn? So a mishmash of comments and questions from Dave.
Yeah, good question, Dave. So, when the drought tolerant hybrids first came out, I did some research on them, and there's been work by other people, and they show that they definitely, um, are more drought tolerant in terms of being able to, in a lot of cases, being able to produce higher yields uh, under drought conditions. Um, and I think what we've seen is that since they first came out, there's kind of been a trend overall for uh, more greater drought tolerance to be bred into the other hybrids. So I think overall, as an industry, there's been a move towards greater drought tolerance in the last, 5 to 10 years. And we've been seeing that, and that's also been one of the reasons why we've been, noticing some spectacular corn yields in years when we've had very dry conditions, but timely amounts of rainfall. So I think rooting has been a key player in that. One of the things that they talk about with drought tolerant corn is the fine roots. So you need the fine roots are important for taking up moisture, and you also want to have some fine roots near the soil surface that can scavenge small amounts of rainfall when they do occur, so they can take advantage of that. With regards to the short stature corn, we know that the short stature corn has very robust root systems. From what I've read, even more robust than standard corn. And that may be advantageous if we have drought conditions, but I don't know of any research that's tested those things. But what's being marketed and what I've read is that the short stature corn does have very robust root systems. So that's something to think about. And from a management standpoint, I don't think there's a lot we can do to influence rooting other than creating a conducive soil environment for those roots to thrive. So that's going to be, avoiding compaction, having moisture, and having, good soil structure, that kind of thing.
Okay. Well, in the interest of time, and because we have had a lot of questions answered here today, which is exactly what this group is all about. I will just read out something from an exchange in the chat, just so folks are aware. Kevin, he said, Minnesota DOT has weather stations throughout the state. He wondered whether it was possible for Dennis and his team to team up with Minnesota Department of Transportation to collect wind data for tracking. And Dennis said, yeah, that's definitely possible, especially with these end-on stations now going up throughout the state. MON, it's called in Minnesota. But the real issue he mentions is that the weather stations need to have their wind meters or anemometers set at the right height so that comparisons can be made. And so that's great points all around. And I will let people know that we have the smartest webinar viewers. Period. So thank you both for presenting here today. I just want to let people know this is the last of our strategic farming Let's Talk Crops programs for the year. We'd like folks to stay tuned for the field notes in season strategic farming series, which will likely start back up Wednesday mornings starting May 8th from 8 to 8:30. We